So there's been an interesting conversation that has really broken out this past week, and it seems like it's because of one game in particular that I'm sure will come up here, but it has to do with the Xbox Series S and potentially an issue that could be popping up as this generation goes on with this system apparently holding back maybe next generation with upcoming games that are only releasing on the Xbox Series and the PlayStation 5. And I wanted to bring in someone who would probably have some better insight than 98% of us because he actually has developed games for these different platforms. In fact, he's gone all the way back to the original Xbox developing applications there. So he's seen it all. Had to bring in MVG, Modern Vintage Gamer. How we doing?
What's going on? It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, John.
Good to have MVG here. So this seemed to pop up with the latest Batman game, Gotham Knights, okay? Now, quality aside for that game, in terms of the review scores and all the stuff we see popping up, performance seems to have been an issue. And one of the things that was brought up was the 30 FPS cap, and then people wondering why can't it just be 60 frames per second. And there's a long explanation from an artist and developer within Rocksteady who talked about their outside views on it, really, because they mentioned they were not part of the development process necessarily, but that there is more involvement for getting that higher frame rate than just sliding around some options and turning resolution down and these different things, right? So they mentioned the larger world, volumetric lighting, all of these different things. But it led to them bringing up the Xbox Series S and that it could be a problem down the road as we go along here. And I assume that has to do with the specifications with the Xbox Series S and so on there. But first, let me ask you, MVG, have you developed anything in particular? You don't have to name exactly which one or anything, but for the Series X and the Series S kind of in tandem.
Yeah, I can. And both of them have already come out. So Quake came out for Series X and Series S, and River City Girls Zero also came out for Series X and S. So I will say, I mean, these are smaller games. They're not AAA games by any stretch, which means that, you know, I don't necessarily have the total picture as far as some of the pain that developers have been talking about with the Series S. But I have definitely made software that targets those hardware platforms. And, you know, my experience is that they've been pretty good to work with. The Series S is a great system to work with. But again, I will, you know, also want to mention that I'm not a AAA dev, so I may not have some of the pain that some of the AAAs are having with the Series S right now.
Well, I'm looking at the specs, and you had a nice little comparison there. The processor is basically the same. The frequency slightly different, but that's the same. And then we also have the GPU built on the same architecture with AMD RDNA 2, and then we also have the same solid state memory when it comes to storage. But what was the biggest difference, you said, between the Series X and the Series S?
Well, it comes down to memory, right? So the Series X has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, and the Series S has 10 gigabytes of GDDR6. Now, between those two systems, that's a pretty big gap, right? 6 gigabytes of RAM. I mean, think about the Switch, right?
Yeah.
You got 4 gigabytes on a Switch. So 6 gigabytes, taking that away from a developer is something that I think a lot of them are not going to be happy with anyway when they just look at a spec sheet, even before they even start to work with the system. But it goes a little deeper than that as well, because the memory is kind of split into two separate banks. So on the Series X, I believe you get 10 gigabytes of main, and then you get kind of this ancillary 6 gigabytes, which is a little slower as far as bandwidth. And then on the Series S, you get 8 gigabytes, which is basically half the kind of the bandwidth as the Series X. And then you get a 2 gigabyte ancillary. So it's kind of those memory banks and the lower kind of bandwidth that's really kind of catching developers out, I think, is the main thing.
Okay, that would affect, because the Series S is, it's been mentioned over and over again, targeting a lower resolution like that 1080p, sometimes 1440. Sometimes it surprises us, but typically targeting that 1080p setup, but still being able to run those games with CPU and AI logic, all the things behind that.
Right.
So I would assume, again, looking from the outside and not developing the games, that even though it's a lower bandwidth, it wouldn't be required because they're not targeting 4K or apparently 8K. We'll see this generation, but not targeting something that's significantly larger. We say 1080p, we say 4K, and there is a large difference between those two. If you set them up and look at a TV screen, then you put 1080p, it's actually like the top rectangle on the left or something. There's much more real estate essentially with 4K in mind. So I look at, for example, the Series S with 224 gigabytes per second with that 8 gigabytes, and I kind of look at that and say, okay, 1080p seems very reasonable within that, based on what we've seen with video cards over the last 4 or 5 years that have been able to accomplish that with similar bandwidth there. So I was looking at the Gotham Knights benchmarks though, and people noticed something, because leading up to the benchmarks that were being done, it was mentioned that you can't just move around resolutions and get better frame rates, and the Series S seems to perform as good and at times better than the PS5 and the Series X. It's not doing the stuff that the Series X and the PS5, it's not targeting 4K. It doesn't have, I'm sure, the same level of ray tracing, if at all, or certain lighting and those aspects, but it's holding its own there at 1440p even.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, the Gotham Knights thing is interesting because there is a narrative there that the Series S is kind of holding everything back, but it's very difficult to say that in this scenario, especially when the benchmarks are kind of all over the place, depending on which system you're on. Seeing the Series S outperform the Series X tells me that there's some underlying optimization that still hasn't been done yet with that game. Now, whether that gets patched, and hopefully it will, right, where we start to see these frame rates get to where they need to be, will be a good thing. But yeah, I mean, if you're seeing the Series S outperforming the Series X, then there's some underlying issue with the code that needs to be addressed.
Right. I mean, no one's, everyone looks at the specs and they're like, the Series X and the PS5 are much stronger than the Series S, and it's priced and marketed in that way anyway. So I don't think anyone's disputing otherwise there. I am curious though, MVG, let's say you're developing a game and you start from scratch, right? You're like, all right, we're going to build this thing up. Do you think in like the beginning phase, and are we going to target that resolution, maybe higher fidelity or frame rate? Where would you even start that in like the production process?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I would probably go as high. I would start with the Series X version and then kind of go down.
Okay.
But that may not be the right way to do things, especially when it comes to AAA. There is a lot of talk about, you should start with the lowest common denominator and then kind of work your way up. But I think what we've seen, at least to date, with the Xbox Series S and X games, is that it seems very likely that most developers are starting out with the Series X version and then moving on to the Series S and getting the appropriate optimizations in that game. And a good example of that is Dying Light. Remember when that first came out? I think even a Dying Light developer came out and kind of made some comments that the Series S wasn't really that powerful. It was holding them. I don't want to say holding them back, because I'm not sure that's what the quote that they said. But eventually if you recall, they got Dying Light running at 60 on the Series S, right? Yep. So same thing with Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk now runs at 60 on the Series S, and originally it didn't come anywhere close to that, if you remember. So I think it's really, developers are starting out on the Series. Developers always want new hardware, the most powerful thing they can have.
Yes.
And the other thing is that Microsoft doesn't have a specific dev kit for a Series S. They only have a Series X dev kit. And what they ask you to do is basically just put it into what they call Series S mode, which is an equivalence, right? So there is actually no hardware for the Series S, at least as far as I know. Someone may tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think there is, right? So most devs kind of start out with the Series X and then move over to the Series S if there's any performance issues or anything like
That's
that.
interesting. So it's just like it like turns off CUs and it changes frequencies and plays around with the RAM pools just to does
exactly that. It basically just turns things off, and it's not exactly a Series S specification, but it's a approximation, we'll call it. of one.
That's interesting. Okay, okay. Then that's kind of something I was thinking about here, especially because we're in this weird time period where cross-gen to me seems like it's going longer than I was expecting. I will say, I thought we were going to be on to these systems already. I understand we had some issues with production of just the console itself to get it out there. And I'm thinking about this from a studio's perspective. You have the PS4, the PS4 Pro, the Xbox One, the Xbox One S. They are slightly different, the One and the One S. I mean, you can provide HDR support even for the One S, the One X. And now we have the Xbox Series X and Series S and the PS5. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot. That's a lot of SKUs to develop for. So if I'll be honest, if I'm a studio and I'm looking around, I'm like, why would we have to have this Series S too? Why can't we just have the Series X and the PS5? Why gotta have this other one? So, I can admit the more SKUs you add in, I'm sure there is more frustration there kind of coming in from the other side. I'll ask you as an example. If you could, all in a perfect world, would you rather just have one Xbox, one PlayStation to develop for, and that's it?
Yeah. I think any developer would agree with me. Having less in this situation is better, right? Like, if we just had a Series X and a PS5, I think most developers would be happy, because again, like you said, you have to focus on two different hardware platforms, and the best outcome is when you make your game for the Series X, it just works really well on the Series S without any major optimizations that need to happen specifically for the Series S. And in my experience, again, with the games that I've worked on, like Quake and River City Girls, there's so much overhead there. So when you make a game run on the Series X and like add in, for example, 120 hertz modes and things like that, on the Series S, those games ran really well because there's a lot of power there. But again, for a AAA, they won't be as lucky in that scenario. But the best outcome is you don't really have to make any changes. But the worst outcome is the game runs out of memory because you're using a lot of that 16 gigabytes, and you have to come up with a better way to manage your memory, reduce textures and things like that. So I definitely feel the pain of developers that are working on the Series S and have to optimize to get their games running at a good level of performance. But I also will kind of say that, look, every console generation has had systems that have had their quirks about it. Like the Switch has its own things. If you go back to the Xbox One and the PS4 era, the Jaguar CPU was pretty terrible as far as performance. Going back even further than that, the 360 and obviously the PS3 was very well documented for being extremely difficult to develop games on, right? So I don't really feel like this is anything different that we're seeing in the past. I think it's just really developers are frustrated. They can get frustrated with the Series S because it's just a smaller scope. It's a lot more limited than the Series X hardware.
So obviously some have mentioned, I'll say, without honing in on any one person or developer, it's out there though, that they have been in meetings or talks where the Series S has kind of been almost asked if they could drop support for it, right? It's been brought, it's at least been talked about. I don't know how true that is or how many developers are out there asking for it, but it's been brought up. And I'm trying to imagine a scenario where it happens. I just can't. Do you think the Series S, they'll be like, look, if you just want to make it for the Series X, it's fine? Or do you think it's just like, nope, they're going to stick with it? Because they're saying that if you're making a game for the Xbox, it has to work on both. It has to release on both platforms.
Yeah. There's no way they'll drop Series S support. At least not for the foreseeable future. It's selling very well for Microsoft, as we know. Mm-hmm. It's doing very well in other countries like Japan, for example. I think it's one of their kind of secret weapons of this generation, the Series S hardware. It's entry level. It is cut down, no question about it, but it's selling well. It's a good move for Microsoft. But again, it's the developers, they have to thinking about, they're focusing on two different targets now versus one. And I think that's where the frustration comes into it. Once you get the game running well on the Series X, your job isn't finished yet. You have to now focus your attention on the Series S. And I think that's where a lot of that frustration is coming from, in my opinion, at least. And I will also say, we don't really know what many developers means, and I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
That I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean it's across the board? If it is, I've not heard about that. And
Okay.
I'm not saying I know everything, but I certainly haven't heard about that. I mean, I've heard developers vent their frustration on the Series S before,
Mhm.
but again, it's because developers want more memory. You know, they don't want less, they want more all the time. So I don't really think it's much to do about anything in this one.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the Famitsu sales chart just as an example, and it's Japan, so it's kind of a small scope compared to Microsoft's stronger territories like in the US as an example. But these will give us hard numbers that are estimates, but again, they at least give us an idea. The Series S is outselling the Series X pretty consistently to where the Series S 203,000, the Series X 164,000 in Japan lifetime so far. So it's kind of hard, I think, for Microsoft to U-turn now. They basically have to stick with it. And if you've noticed, especially over the last month or two, we're seeing a lot of promotions for the Series S to where these things are like $250 and they'll give you a game or a controller with it.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
they're pushing these things out there.
it's a great system, especially to jump into the kind of the Xbox environment, and of course, you know, Game Pass as well. It's very compelling for many people to kind of jump in with a level entry or budget entry next generation system. So there's no way Microsoft is going to give it up. I mean, are they going to continue to support it throughout the entire generation? Well, maybe not. They may kind of, you know, retire it at some point. But I think for the next at least 6 or 7 years, we're gonna have the Series
Could
S.
do a Series S revision.
Could do. Yeah,
Series
they could do that.
SX.
Yep. Absolutely.
So be careful with marketing on that one. Yeah.
they're not afraid to do that, as we know with the One X and everything. So they could give us a specification boost mid generation.
Okay. And I do want to ask you this, MVG, as we finish up here. The law of diminishing returns. I feel like we're getting up against it now, and the Series S selling so well. I know a lot of it has to do with the pricing too. Do you think this is something that developers are really going to start taking into account? Because I gotta say, Gotham Knights, I think Arkham Knight looks better. All right. And that was a while ago, but a lot of that's more the artistic side of things and the way they've set that game up in different parts of the city. I look at what we've seen here with the most recent Batman game, and I don't believe that the performance trade-off for what they're trying to do in terms of fidelity is worth it. And I kind of feel like we're running up against that law of diminishing returns to where it makes more sense to go towards the performance side of things rather than just the fidelity. And if that's something that will affect development over the next 5 or 6 years.
I agree. And look, I think we should give Gotham Knights the benefit of the doubt. I do think that the team there is fully aware of the limitations of the game right now and its performance implications. And I'm going to kind of treat this the same way as, like I said, Dying Light and Cyberpunk, where eventually the game comes good. Now, what does that mean for sales and everything? Well, that's a different conversation. But I do think developers at that studio, I mean, they look at the feedback. They're on Twitter. They see what's going on there. So I think that there's a pretty good chance that game will get patched and will get a good performance boost at some point.
All right, good. Because out of everyone in the Spawncast, apparently I'm the one who has to play it. No one else is buying it. It's just me, and I'm halfway through Call of Duty, and Call of Duty's actually been pretty good so far.
I'm gonna get it, but I'll just wait for a sale.
That's probably a good idea. So, but MVG, thanks for joining me today, and make sure you guys check him out. I got his link down below in the description. Has some cool stuff coming up every Monday. You're there.
Yep.
So really cool stuff, and make sure you check out his old videos on the original Xbox, especially as like a lot of the development kits for it. It's fun stuff all the way around.
Check out the channel.
So thanks everyone for tuning in with us, and we'll see you next time.